The documentary opens with grainy home videos of the Bryants at church events, laughing alongside Pastor Kenneth. Narration explains the depth of trust built over the years. Deanna often said Kenneth was the man God sent to lead us through life's storms. But in private, Kenneth's behavior toward Lily had grown unsettling. It started with private counseling sessions after youth group, where he would speak to her for hours about sin, shame, and purity. By the time Lily turned 18, these meetings became even more secretive, held behind locked office doors under the guise of preparing her for a godly marriage. Lily, feeling honored by Kenneth's attention, kept the sessions to herself, even from her mother. However, her demeanor began to change. Once lively and spirited, Lily became withdrawn, frequently ill and anxious. Deanna assumed it was the stress of nursing school. Then, a few months after her 19th birthday, Lily collapsed during a clinical rotation. At the hospital, blood tests revealed the devastating truth. Lily was HIV positive. The diagnosis sent shockwaves through the Bryant family. Lily, tearful and confused, swore she had never been sexually active. Doctors pressed her gently, but Lily insisted. There had only been one man who had ever touched her intimately, though she initially refused to name him. When she finally broke down, she whispered a name that stunned the room silent: Pastor Kenneth Moore. When Lily's confession reached her parents, the Bryants were gripped by disbelief, rage, and guilt. Eric sat in the hospital chair, fists clenched so tightly his knuckles whitened. Deanna wept uncontrollably, blaming herself for trusting Kenneth so blindly. In the days that followed, they agonized over their next move. Eric wanted to call the police immediately. Deanna hesitated, fearing the public shame that could follow, not just for Lily, but for their entire family. In a town like Hartsville, whispers traveled faster than fire. Victims often faced harsher judgment than perpetrators. Despite the turmoil, they confronted Lily once more, desperate for clarity. Lily, shaking, reiterated everything: the locked-door meetings, the inappropriate blessings, the escalating advances masked as spiritual rites. She felt trapped, ashamed, and too confused to resist a man she had been taught to obey without question. Eric, shaking with fury, drove straight to the church the next evening. The parking lot was full for Wednesday night service. Kenneth stood at the door, smiling warmly, greeting families. When Eric stormed toward him, Kenneth caught the storm in his eyes immediately. "Brother Eric, let's talk privately," Kenneth said, guiding him toward the office. Witnesses later recalled how Eric looked like a man on the edge. Inside the office, Eric barely held himself together. He accused Kenneth outright. Kenneth, maintaining a calm facade, denied everything. He insinuated that Lily was confused, perhaps had fallen into sin elsewhere, and was now scapegoating him out of fear. When Eric threatened to call the police, Kenneth's mask cracked ever so slightly. He leaned closer, lowering his voice to a venomous whisper. "Think very carefully about what you're about to do. I have the town. You have nothing but shame." Meanwhile, Deanna, battling her own instincts, reached out to a close friend, someone she trusted in the congregation. Tearfully, she revealed what Lily had disclosed, but instead of support, she encountered something colder: disbelief. "You're saying Kenneth? Pastor Moore?" the friend repeated, shaking her head. "No, Deanna, you're confused. Lily must be lying. He's a man of God." Within hours, whispers began to swirl, not about Kenneth's betrayal, but about the Bryant family's unstable daughter and their grudge against the church. The Bryants realized they were facing not just Kenneth, but the entire machinery that protected him. As the days turned into weeks, the Bryants found themselves increasingly ostracized. Invitations dried up. Deanna's colleagues at the school started avoiding her in the staff lounge. Eric's auto repair business, once thriving off loyal parishioner customers, suddenly saw cancellations without explanation. The worst part was seeing Lily retreat further into herself. Her once bright spirit was now a faint flicker. She spent most days curled up in her room, her nursing textbooks untouched, her future, once so full of hope, crumbling before her eyes. Her body, too, was weakening. Lily developed frequent fevers, bouts of nausea, and relentless fatigue. The doctors had started her on antiretroviral therapy, but they warned the Bryants. The earlier the infection is caught, the better. For Lily, the disease had already made itself at home. Eric, once a steady hand, now lived in a simmering state of fury. Every day he passed Kenneth's smiling face on church billboards and community flyers felt like a slap. Every time someone averted their eyes at the grocery store, his blood boiled hotter. Deanna, struggling to hold the family together, suggested quietly contacting law enforcement. She reasoned that a private investigation could at least collect evidence, without immediately igniting a public scandal that would only further vilify Lily. Reluctantly, Eric agreed. They met with Detective Caroline Pratt, a seasoned investigator known for her discretion. Caroline listened carefully to Lily's story, asked patient, respectful questions, and took meticulous notes. Caroline warned them it would be difficult. Kenneth's position meant that a standard he-said-she-said dynamic would almost certainly favor him unless they found tangible proof, messages, witnesses, or corroborating evidence. Meanwhile, Kenneth moved quickly. He began subtly spreading a narrative from the pulpit, sermons about false accusers, those led astray by temptation, and the forces seeking to destroy good men. He never mentioned the Bryants by name, but the subtext was razor-sharp and his congregation absorbed every word. He also took more direct action. An anonymous letter arrived at the Bryant home, scrawled in crude handwriting. "God will punish liars. Leave town before he does." Deanna's hands trembled as she read it aloud. Eric pocketed the letter, his jaw tight. No more waiting, he thought if the system wouldn't protect his daughter, he would. Detective Caroline Pratt started methodically. She subpoenaed medical records, consulted with Lily's doctors, and reviewed counseling logs from the church, anything that could establish contact and patterns of behavior between Kenneth and Lily. Her investigation quickly hit roadblocks. Church administrators were suspiciously uncooperative, citing privacy concerns. Community members, when approached, either refused to speak or defended Kenneth fervently. Some even suggested Lily had always been an attention seeker. Pratt knew from experience that small towns often closed ranks around beloved figures. Still, she persisted. Meanwhile, at home, tensions within the Bryant family grew thicker by the day. Eric couldn't sleep. He sat awake, night after night, nursing black coffee and rage. Deanna worried about him but felt powerless to pull him back from the abyss he was slipping into. One evening, while Deanna tried to coax Lily into eating a few bites of dinner, Eric stood at the window watching the dark street. His mind played dangerous games, imagining what it would take to make Kenneth pay without relying on a system rigged in his favor. The threats against the family also escalated. A rock shattered their living room window one night. The word liars spray-painted across the front porch the next morning. They called the police, but no one was arrested. The official report labeled it vandalism by unknown parties. Caroline Pratt suspected church loyalists but lacked evidence. During a follow-up interview, Caroline gently asked Lily if there were any messages, texts, emails between her and Kenneth. Lily shook her head. He had been careful, always speaking in person, always couching his advances in religious language that sounded harmless to any outsider. But there was one thing, a hidden journal Lily had kept, documenting her confusion, fear, and guilt after each meeting with Kenneth. She hesitated but finally handed it over. Caroline flipped through it carefully. It wasn't concrete proof, but it painted a chilling picture and showed consistency in Lily's claims. Still, Caroline knew it wasn't enough. She needed something irrefutable to bring formal charges against Kenneth, something even the town couldn't ignore. At the same time, Kenneth began meeting privately with influential town leaders. Under the guise of prayer meetings, he was preparing for war, ensuring that when, not if, the accusations went public, the Bryants would be seen as bitter, unstable, and malicious. Caroline Pratt sat late in her office, Lily's journal spread open before her, highlighting passages for potential use. But it gnawed at her. A journal was considered hearsay in court. No physical evidence, no eyewitnesses. If Kenneth was ever going to face justice, it wouldn't happen through traditional channels alone. Meanwhile, Eric grew quieter at home, his silences darker, heavier. He spent his evenings in the garage, the metallic sounds of hammering and drilling filling the cold night air. Deanna worried but dared not ask what he was working on. One evening, Lily woke them with a scream. She had discovered a dead animal, a cat, mutilated and dumped on their porch. Taped to its lifeless body was another note: "Justice is coming, for you." Deanna broke down, sobbing. Lily was inconsolable. Eric calmly picked up the carcass, tossed it into a trash bag, and said nothing. But something in his eyes, something final, hardened that night. Elsewhere in town, Kenneth hosted a healing service, filled with prayers for false accusers and fiery speeches against the spread of wicked lies within our community. Several town officials were photographed praying over him, sealing his narrative of martyrdom even tighter. In private, Kenneth wasn't so pious. He called an emergency meeting with the church board and suggested taking legal action against the Bryants for defamation. It would be a bold move, turning the accuser into the accused, but he was confident the town would support him. The Bryant family's financial situation deteriorated just as fast. Customers abandoned Eric's garage. Deanna was placed on indefinite leave pending a review of her conduct at the school. Bills piled up, and Lily's medical expenses, already astronomical, threatened to drown them. Desperation clamped around Eric's throat. His rage was no longer a storm. It was a cold, deliberate pressure. He began tracking Kenneth's movements, noting the pastor's routines, his patterns, where he went after sermons, where he parked his car, how late he stayed at the church. Caroline, sensing the rising danger, tried to keep the Bryants engaged, offering updates and reassurances, but deep down she knew. The fuse had already been lit. Eric's preparations grew more focused. He purchased a second-hand revolver at a pawn shop outside Hartsville, using cash and a false name. He cleaned it meticulously in the garage, the metallic click of the cylinder spinning blending with the low hum of the old radio he left running to drown out his conscience. Each night, Eric mapped Kenneth's routine with greater precision. He learned that Kenneth often stayed late at the church on Fridays, preparing sermons alone in the administrative wing. Few people came by after 9 o'clock. No cameras monitored the rear parking lot. No security guards patrolled that side of the building. Meanwhile, Caroline pushed her investigation harder. She located another young woman, now living out of state, who agreed to speak to her confidentially. The woman, Sarah Kenton, described similar encounters with Kenneth years ago. Meetings masked as private counseling, moments of inappropriate touching, subtle threats to her spiritual standing. It was a breakthrough. But without Sarah willing to testify formally, and without physical evidence tying Kenneth to Lily's infection, Caroline still didn't have a case strong enough to withstand the town's loyalty to him. The next day, the Bryants received a formal letter from Kenneth's attorneys, notifying them of a pending defamation lawsuit. The sum demanded was outrageous: $500,000 in damages. The intent was clear: financial annihilation. Deanna wept over the kitchen table, the unopened bills spread around her like confetti. Lily sat silently, staring at nothing, her face pale and hollowed. In that moment, Eric made his decision. That evening, under the pretense of going to a late-night parts run for the garage, Eric tucked the revolver into the back waistband of his jeans and left. Deanna suspected something was wrong but couldn't find the strength to stop him. She simply watched from the doorway as he disappeared into the night. At the same time, Caroline reviewed the case notes at her desk, unease gnawing at her. She called Eric's cell phone, intending to request another meeting. It rang 5 times before going to voicemail. Her gut told her something terrible was in motion, and she was already too late to stop it. The church was nearly deserted when Eric pulled into the rear parking lot. His truck's headlights clicked off, leaving him in darkness. He sat behind the wheel for a moment, gripping the revolver resting on the passenger seat, steadying his breathing. Inside the church, Kenneth's office light glowed faintly. Eric knew the layout. He had attended countless late-night meetings here over the years, trusted this man with his prayers, his fears, his family. He slipped through the side entrance. The smell of old wood polish and candle wax filled his nose, so familiar it almost stopped him in his tracks. For a split second, memories of community barbecues, Christmas services and baptisms flickered through his mind. But then another image, Lily, pale and broken in a hospital bed, hardened his resolve. Eric moved down the hallway, silent. In the office, Kenneth hunched over his desk, papers strewn before him, muttering to himself. From the crack in the door, Eric could hear fragments. Disloyalty, punish the wicked. No one will believe them. Eric pushed the door open with the barrel of the gun. Kenneth looked up, startled, mouth open to speak, but no words came out. Eric stepped inside, locking the door behind him with a sharp click. For a moment, the two men just stared at each other. Kenneth recovered first, lifting his hands slightly, palms out. "Brother Eric, whatever you're thinking..." "Stop!" Eric growled. His voice was low, unfamiliar even to his own ears. "You called my daughter a liar. You let her waste away while you preached about forgiveness." Kenneth's face twisted, a grotesque blend of fear and disdain. "You're ruining your life over a mistake. Your daughter, she's not pure, Eric. She's broken. She came to me." The words hit like a hammer. Eric's hands tightened around the gun. "You infected her," Eric said, each word cutting through the air. "You destroyed her." Kenneth leaned forward slightly, voice dripping poison. "You're just mad because you couldn't control her." Eric's vision narrowed. Every humiliation, every cold stare from their neighbors, every moment of Lily's suffering, it all condensed into a single, blinding rage. The gun trembled slightly in his hand. 1 second stretched into eternity. Outside, Caroline Pratt's car screeched into the parking lot, her badge and service pistol ready, heart hammering as she raced toward the darkened building. Inside, Eric's decision hung in the balance. Life, death, and something far beyond either. Before the sound of a single gunshot shattered the night, Caroline burst through the side door, her gun drawn, the metallic echo of the shot still vibrating through the empty halls. Inside Kenneth's office, the scene was frozen in horror. Kenneth slumped against the bookshelf, a dark stain blooming across his chest, his hand feebly grasping at nothing. His breathing was shallow, wet, each gasp rattling louder than the last. Eric stood motionless, the revolver hanging limply at his side, his face slack, almost childlike in its emptiness. His shirt was spattered with flecks of blood. His eyes locked onto Caroline as she moved cautiously toward him. "Eric," she said firmly, trying to keep her voice steady. "Drop the weapon now." He obeyed numbly, letting the revolver clatter to the floor. His knees buckled, and he sank into a chair, staring at Kenneth, who made a gurgling sound before his body stilled. Caroline holstered her weapon, rushed to Kenneth's side, and checked for a pulse. Nothing. Kenneth Moore, the revered pastor, the town's spiritual anchor, was dead. Within minutes, backup arrived. Yellow tape went up around the church. Reporters, alerted by the police scanner, began gathering at the perimeter. Eric was placed in cuffs without resistance. As the officers led him away, he didn't shout, didn't struggle. He only muttered, "I had no choice. He left me no choice." Inside the patrol car, Eric sat in silence, replaying the moment over and over. The look in Kenneth's eyes, the finality of the gunshot. Word spread through Hartsville like wildfire. Some residents refused to believe the initial reports, insisting it had to be a mistake. Others, quieter but no less fervent, whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, the Bryants had been telling the truth all along. Deanna received the news at home. When the knock came, she opened the door to find Caroline, face grave. No words were needed. Deanna collapsed into the officer's arms, her sobs racking the small, fragile house. And Lily, fragile, ill Lily, simply stared blankly at the wall, a single tear sliding down her cheek. The man who had stolen her future was dead, but the cost had shattered her family beyond recognition. As night deepened over Hartsville, the town's golden facade began to crack. Underneath, buried resentment, guilt, and complicity simmered. And now there was no turning back. At the police station, Eric sat in a gray interview room, the bloodstains still visible on his shirt cuffs. Across from him, Detective Caroline Pratt tried to navigate the impossible balance between duty and empathy. "Eric," she said carefully, "you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say—" "I know," he interrupted, voice hollow. He stared at the wall as if seeing something far beyond it. "I don't regret it," he added quietly. I wish I'd done it sooner." Caroline sighed inwardly. Eric wasn't interested in defense strategies or mitigating circumstances. He had already condemned himself. Across town, the public memorial for Kenneth Moore was hastily organized. A crowd filled the church lawn, holding candles and singing hymns. News vans lined the streets. Several prominent figures gave emotional speeches, hailing Kenneth as a man of God, struck down by hate and lies. Yet not everyone stood in solidarity. A quieter group, former church members, skeptics, and those who had heard whispers long before Lily's tragedy, gathered in smaller circles, questioning whether the town's beloved pastor was truly the martyr he was being painted as. Inside the Bryant home, Deanna fought to hold the pieces together. Reporters hounded them. Strangers left hateful messages on their porch. Friends they had known for years refused to make eye contact at the grocery store. Lily barely spoke. She moved like a ghost through the house, guilt and sorrow carving deep hollows into her cheeks. In the few moments she found her voice, she whispered to her mother, "It's my fault. I destroyed everything." Deanna, exhausted beyond words, cradled her daughter and repeated the same truth over and over. "You did nothing wrong." Meanwhile, Kenneth's former allies, town leaders, business owners, and church officials, scrambled to salvage their reputations. Some distanced themselves quietly. Others doubled down, vowing to ensure that Eric faced the harshest possible punishment. Caroline, reviewing the early case file, realized something chilling. Kenneth's death had shifted the town's narrative from suspicion back to blind hero worship. In death, Kenneth was being sanctified. Eric was the villain now, and the facts of Kenneth's crimes against Lily risked being buried under collective denial. The district attorney's office announced that they intended to seek the maximum sentence for Eric Bryant, first-degree murder. The courthouse steps were crowded on the day of Eric's bail hearing. Protesters lined the sidewalks, some holding signs demanding justice for Pastor Moore, others more quietly holding signs that read, "Believe the victims." Reporters shouted questions as Deanna arrived, shielding Lily with her body. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Every bench filled, every whisper amplified. Deanna sat with Lily at her side, clutching her daughter's trembling hand. Eric was led into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, his wrists shackled. He looked thinner, older, as though he had aged years in the span of days. The prosecution painted Eric as a calculated, dangerous individual who had executed a beloved community leader. They argued that he posed a risk to the public and should be denied bail. Eric's public defender tried to counter, citing the Bryant family's harassment, Lily's medical condition, and Kenneth's abuses, but without tangible proof admitted into evidence, the arguments rang hollow to a jury steeped in Kenneth's myth. The judge ruled swiftly, no bail. Eric would remain in custody until trial. Deanna felt the last of her strength drain away as the gavel struck. Outside, reporters swarmed again. Someone shouted, "Was your husband always violent?" Another sneered, "Will your daughter testify against him?" Deanna pulled Lily closer and kept walking. Detective Caroline Pratt watched from a distance, her fists clenched at her sides. She knew what Eric had done was illegal, but deep down she understood why he had done it. Kenneth had constructed a fortress of reputation and power that strangled truth at its roots. Now in death he was more untouchable than ever, Later that evening, Caroline filed her report, but not before slipping a photocopy of Lily's journal pages into an anonymous envelope addressed to the district attorney. She couldn't testify herself without compromising the case, but she could make sure the truth had a chance to surface. Meanwhile, Deanna made a desperate decision. She would start reaching out quietly to the few people who might still believe them. If there was any chance to save Eric from a life sentence, they would need allies, and fast. Deanna worked quietly, reaching out to anyone who might still listen. Old friends, distant relatives, even former church members who had left before Kenneth's influence became all-consuming. Some doors slammed shut in her face, others opened cautiously, people whispering that they had heard things about Kenneth, but had been too afraid to speak up. Deanna collected each fragment, each hesitant recollection, building a fragile mosaic of the truth. Meanwhile, Eric met with his court-appointed defense attorney inside the jail. The young lawyer, Jonathan Cross, was blunt. "We can argue diminished capacity, temporary insanity, but if we have any shot, we need to establish motive in a way that the jury can't ignore." Jonathan showed Eric a copy of the leaked journal pages. Eric's hands shook as he recognized Lily's careful handwriting. It was a risk to use the journal in open court. It would mean exposing Lily to brutal cross-examination, but it was also the only real evidence they had. Eric hesitated. He didn't want his daughter dragged through more pain, but when Jonathan asked him what Lily would want, Eric closed his eyes and nodded. They would fight. The trial date was set for 6 weeks later. Tensions in town rose like steam under a locked lid. More vandalism appeared at the Bryant home. Someone spray-painted "Killer Family" across their garage. Deanna found another dead animal left on their porch. This time, a crow with its wings broken. Caroline continued working behind the scenes, careful to keep her involvement hidden. She reached out to Sarah Kenton again, the woman who had fled Hartsville years ago after her own encounter with Kenneth, and convinced her to submit a sworn affidavit detailing her experiences. It wasn't direct evidence, but it added weight to Lily's account and undermined the pristine image Kenneth's supporters clung to. Meanwhile, Lily struggled with whether she could bear to testify. The thought of facing the same community that had turned against her made her physically ill. But after a long night sitting silently with her mother, Lily finally whispered, "I have to, for Dad." Across town, the prosecution team, eager to preserve the town's image, prepared their own strategy. They would paint Eric as an unstable man who had invented accusations to justify murder. They would cast Lily as a confused, sick young woman manipulated by her vengeful parents. The lines were drawn. Neither side would emerge from this trial unscathed. The morning of the trial's opening arguments, Hartsville's courthouse buzzed like a live wire. Police erected barriers along the sidewalks, separating protesters from supporters. News vans idled outside, antennas raised, reporters broadcasting every small movement to an eager, polarized audience. Inside the courtroom, the tension was suffocating. Eric sat beside Jonathan Cross, dressed in a plain suit, his face hollow but determined. Across the aisle, Deanna and Lily sat quietly, their hands intertwined. The prosecution opened first. The assistant district attorney, a polished woman named Dana Whitlock, stepped forward, painting a vivid portrait of Eric as a man who had allowed bitterness and rage to fester until it exploded into premeditated violence. She described Kenneth Moore as a pillar of morality, a victim, she insisted, of a dangerous and deluded man seeking revenge for imagined sins. She said little about Lily directly, careful to avoid invoking too much sympathy, but hinted that false memories and emotional manipulation could explain her accusations. Then Jonathan Cross rose. His opening was quieter, less theatrical. He spoke not of revenge, but of betrayal. Betrayal by a man who used trust, power, and faith to commit unspeakable harm. He described Lily's life before and after the abuse. He introduced the journal as evidence, along with Sarah Kenton's affidavit. And he promised that the defense would show the jury a truth the town had refused to see for too long. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jonathan said, "this case is about what happens when evil wears a righteous face." The first witnesses were called. The prosecution paraded Kenneth's supporters across the stand, deacons, teachers, local business owners, each describing Kenneth as a moral compass, a man beyond reproach. They carefully avoided specifics, relying on Kenneth's reputation to do most of the work. The defense countered with what little they had: inconsistencies, subtle contradictions in testimony, and most critically, the introduction of Lily's journal into the court record. Each day dragged like a year. At home, Deanna struggled to keep Lily's strength up, knowing that soon her daughter would have to face the courtroom and the people who once called her family. Meanwhile, Jonathan Cross prepared Lily for the most important testimony of her life. They rehearsed questions, anticipated attacks, steeled her for the character assassination the prosecution would surely unleash. Across town, whispers grew. Some parishioners began questioning what they once believed. Quietly, a few former members of Kenneth's congregation reached out to Deanna, offering words of support. Too late to prevent the tragedy, but maybe not too late to change its ending. The courtroom was so silent it felt like the air had been sucked out of it. Jonathan Cross stood. The defense calls Lily Bryant to the stand. Lily rose from her seat beside Deanna, moving slowly, her steps deliberate. Her body looked frail under the oversized blazer she wore, her face pale but determined. Every eye in the room locked onto her, some with pity, others with suspicion, and many with thinly veiled contempt. Taking the oath, Lily's voice wavered but held. Jonathan approached gently, his questions slow, careful. He asked about her relationship with Pastor Kenneth Moore, how it began with admiration, evolved into private counseling sessions, and eventually crossed lines she hadn't fully understood until it was too late. Her voice trembled when she spoke about the first time Kenneth touched her inappropriately, how he framed it as part of purifying her spirit, manipulating her trust and faith. She described the shame, the confusion, the fear of speaking out against someone everyone revered. Then came the day she collapsed at the hospital, the devastating diagnosis, and the horrifying realization that the man who had guided her spiritually had infected her permanently, branding her body with his betrayal. Jonathan laid the journal on the evidence table. Lily confirmed it as hers, each word an echo of her private pain. When it came time for cross-examination, the prosecution moved swiftly and cruelly. They questioned her memory, suggesting that trauma had distorted her perceptions. They implied her illness could have come from other sources, sowing doubts without proof. They hinted that Eric and Deanna had planted these ideas in her fragile mind. Lily sat through it all, hands clasped tightly together, knuckles white. But she never wavered. She answered each question steadily, eyes sometimes glancing toward Eric and toward Deanna, whose silent strength radiated across the room. As she finished her testimony, a fissure cracked through the courtroom's atmosphere. For the first time, a few faces in the gallery looked uncertain, shaken. People whispered, others turned away, faces pale. The truth, long buried under layers of trust and denial, was forcing its way into the light. Outside the courthouse, the crowds grew restless. Reporters relayed every word of Lily's testimony in real time. Social media exploded with divided opinions, some calling Lily courageous, others calling her a liar. Inside, as Lily stepped down from the stand, Eric met her eyes. He mouthed the words, "I'm proud of you." It didn't undo the damage. It didn't erase the past, but it was a thread of connection, thin but unbreakable, between a father and a daughter who had lost nearly everything but each other. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric as closing arguments began. Dana Whitlock, the lead prosecutor, rose first. Her voice was calm, rehearsed, but the sharpness in her tone betrayed her urgency. She framed Eric as a man who took justice into his own hands and committed cold-blooded murder, regardless of his emotional pain. She acknowledged Lily's suffering, choosing her words carefully, but emphasized that real justice is determined through law, not through the barrel of a gun. Her closing tried to pull the jury back toward order, rules, and the sanctity of the system, even in the face of personal tragedy. Then Jonathan Cross stood. He didn't thunder. He didn't grandstand. His closing was quiet, raw, almost a conversation. "Sometimes," he said, "evil wears a familiar face. Sometimes it preaches from pulpits and blesses our children with the same hands it uses to destroy them." He walked slowly past the jurors, his voice unwavering. "You've heard the testimony. You've read the words Lily wrote when she had no reason to lie, no reason to believe anyone would ever read them. You've heard from another victim, one of many perhaps, who fled because no one in this town would listen." He turned to Eric, who sat still, staring at the floor. This man loved his daughter. He failed to protect her once. When he realized the depth of her suffering, when he saw that the institutions meant to protect them were closing ranks around her abuser, he broke. Jonathan ended simply, "You have to decide what justice looks like, not just for Eric Bryant, but for all of us." The judge gave final instructions. The jury was dismissed to deliberate. Outside, rain had started to fall. a slow, steady drizzle that turned the protest signs and prayer candles into soggy ruins. News outlets speculated endlessly, analyzing every word, every shift in tone. Inside the courthouse, Deanna and Lily waited in a small room, the hours stretching unbearably. Deanna tried to read. Lily stared blankly at the window, and Caroline Pratt, who had come unofficially, sat quietly nearby, offering silent support. Eric sat alone in a holding cell, replaying everything. The moments he failed to act, the night he pulled the trigger. Lily's voice shaking on the stand. There was no path back, he knew, only forward, into whatever judgment awaited. After 6 grueling hours, the court was called back into session. The jury had reached a verdict. The spectators filed in, some crossing themselves, others whispering prayers. Eric was brought in, shackled at the wrists, his face expressionless, but his hands trembling. The jury foreman stood, the slip of paper in his hand shaking ever so slightly. Everyone held their breath as the judge asked the final question. The jury foreman's voice broke the unbearable silence. In the matter of the state of Texas versus Eric Bryant on the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty of voluntary manslaughter. A low ripple moved through the courtroom, a mixture of gasps, whispers, and stunned silence. Deanna gripped Lily's hand tighter, both relief and heartbreak flooding her at once. The judge thanked the jury, then turned to Eric. His face remained unreadable, but his shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but in grim acceptance. Sentencing was immediate. Eric was sentenced to 10 years in prison, eligible for parole after 6. The judge cited the extraordinary emotional circumstances and the overwhelming betrayal that had led to Kenneth's death, but emphasized that taking the law into one's own hands cannot go unpunished. Eric turned once to look at Deanna and Lily as he was led away. Lily mouthed, "I love you," tears streaming freely down her face. Eric smiled, small, tired, but real, before disappearing behind the heavy wooden door. Outside the courthouse, reactions were split violently. Some mourned, clutching framed photos of Kenneth. Others cheered quietly, grateful that, at least partially, the truth had been recognized. In the days that followed, the town of Hartsville began to change, but slowly and painfully. Some congregants abandoned the church altogether. Others dug in deeper, clinging to Kenneth's myth, refusing to believe anything that tarnished their image of him. Detective Caroline Pratt quietly resigned 6 months later. She had seen too much, and the cracks in the system were too deep to ignore. Before she left, she visited Deanna and Lily, not as an officer, but as a friend. She apologized for everything the system couldn't do, and Lily hugged her tightly without a word. Deanna sold their home. Too many memories, too many threats. She and Lily moved 2 towns over, renting a small apartment near Lily's new college. Against all odds, Lily returned to her nursing studies, determined to rebuild what Kenneth had tried to destroy. Eric's letters came regularly from prison, full of pride, sorrow, and a relentless hope that someday they would all heal. There would be no true justice for what was lost, no clean ending. The scars Kenneth left behind would stay with them for the rest of their lives, but they were still alive, still moving forward. And sometimes, survival itself is the only justice left.